You weren't? What? No, you weren't.
Almost in the middle of Yorgos Lanthimos' bizarre cryptic triptych, our characters find themselves watching a pornography clip of engaging in what the aficionados call a foursome.
Could you turn the volume down a little?
Much like the director's other films, his characters here are portrayed as simple animals with sophisticated desires, and Kinds of Kindness, to my eye, is a film about desire itself. The three oddly connected stories inside the film seem to operate around a code, as referenced by the off-key piano notes playing throughout the three stories. There isn't much clear parallel to interpret between the stories themselves, except a psychological one. Each story operates around orders being given to its protagonist subjects, and in the absurdism of the film's atmosphere, the success doesn't ultimately seem to matter much. The world has a way of making everything seem so futile, it jumps from one story to the other in a very tone-deaf and formalistic style, something we can fully decrypt only after analyzing each story independently. In the four fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, philosopher Jacques Lacan argues that man's desire is the desire of the other. And in this sense, the orders on which each of the main characters in the film operate links directly to their desire, to their urge to please the other person. Perhaps this is the best place to address the weird title of the film. In the scope of Lacan's idea of desire, the central acts in the film manage to qualify as acts of kindness, at least in the ironic sense that the director is trying to envision. The second crucial point of analysis of the three different stories is from the point of view of Lacan's three registers, realms that he considers the pillars on which the structure of the human psyche is based. In this way, I will break down each of the three naked desires and kinds of kindness, how they evolve through the film from story to story, and ultimately, how the film conveys the decay and downfall of human desire itself. The first story in Kinds of Kindness, titled The Death of RMF, starts with an odd scene that makes clear the Lacanian dynamics with which the film operates. At its center, we have RMF, a symbolic messenger with no identity who gives a package to the ego ideal of the story, Vivian, the embodiment of how the ego imagines themselves to be, being validated by the vertical pan of the camera and following the right procedure as ordered by the big other Raymond, on whose strings the entire scene plays. This sets up the orchestral nature of desire in this part, and the dichotomy between the exterior and interior is made very clear over here. This setup adds a new level of meaning to the apparently meaningless Weevil conversation scene between Raymond and Vivian, becoming a demonstration to our ego of how a conversation should be with the big other. In this world of shoulds and should nots, we cut to the protagonist, the ego of the story, who isn't really granted easy access to the big other's home, and whose moves are tuned to the notes of a piano.
Good evening.
Presumably being played by Vivian in the background.
I'm going to water the plants, and then I think I might practice playing the song on the piano.
Robert is just like a child in the film, following the big other's orders. This time he's preparing to run into a car carrying RMF. But this task unfortunately fails when Robert is unable to make the accident fatal, hence kicking off a series of disturbances that form the center of the story. Post-accident, when Robert returns home, we see him following a tight schedule, later revealed to be ordained by Raymond's own written word. According to Lacan, children in the mirror stage of their development start craving a symbolic schedule that is provided to them by language. Quote, a law that apportions satisfactions, as Professor Aaron Dunlop notes in his Lacan lecture. This mirror stage is twice emphasized in the frame, clearly giving us the idea that Robert is like a child who anxiously leans onto the image he projects to identify himself. The cinematograph tends to give us the feeling that every little action, hand movement, and overall reality is being monitored by the eye of the big other. This makes clear the psychoanalytic dynamic of this story. It is akin to a parent-child relationship between Raymond and his subjects, and Robert is clearly not the poster child that pleases Raymond. While the failed car crash was an indirect way to signify this, we get the first clear sign of this when we notice Robert reading Anna Karenina and just being on page 21 of it, but straight up lying to Raymond when they meet about his progress on the book.
Did you read Anna Karenina?
Just finishing it off. There's a few pages left.
On the surface, Robert tries to live by each word of Raymond's instruction, but there's a streak of disobedience in him
I'd like a double Johnny Walker Red on the Rocks, please.
that slowly uncovers itself.
Just getting a Virgin Mary, please.
Right away, sir.
In terms of editing,
Hello.
one extremely fascinating detail in the story is the use of long L cuts.
I might need to pass by the construction site this afternoon. I might not make it back in time.
If I were you, I would have passed by the construction site this afternoon. Mr. Frischman wants to see you in his office at 3.
As a result of which the audio of a previous scene bleeds into the next. This was hinted subtly by Vivian's piano playing into the next scene way after it ends. But the more obvious L cuts manage to show how the commands of the previous scene dictate Robert's life as he lives
Go to
it.
Cheval, sit at the bar, ask them to bring you a drink, something non-alcoholic so it doesn't cloud your judgment. Then come by my house tonight and let me know what you decided.
Good evening, sir.
Further underlining the orchestral motif. In extension, when Robert meets Raymond, the conversation is cut such that the camera often stays on Robert while being subjected to the judgment of Raymond.
Don't get it cut. Let it grow a little longer. And you've lost more weight, I think. Skinny men are the most ridiculous thing there is.
To undercut the significance of Robert himself when he gets the opportunity to talk,
I will be joining you after all for the trip to Munich.
the camera refuses to show his face as he's ignored by Raymond. And in the scope of language, it is interesting to see how Robert is given an illusion of choice in the story.
Aren't you and Sarah thinking of having children?
And this illusion of choice is what seems to be an emotional breaking point for him. Through language, Raymond as the father shapes Robert's limits of imagination.
Again, come in and sit down there before you speak.
He prescribes a procedure for him that almost molds Robert's self. So even when he lets him go to live his own life, Robert isn't able to live beyond the life set out for him, as highlighted by the jarring piano notes. According to Jacques Lacan, one of the pivotal registers that becomes most prevalent in the psychological development of a child is the imaginary register. The child sees himself in the mirror stage, assuming the eyes of their parents, because it is the parent that initially teaches them language and identity. So when the parent lets go of Robert, he fails at cooking. His wife leaves him, and the possessions given to him by Raymond that he considered intimately priceless end up with very little value in the market. At this stage, the editor uses jump cuts to highlight the helplessness of his psyche as nothing goes in his favor, and the elaborate ego of the child now lays broken. Suddenly, the piano becomes diegetic, as if Robert's mind is being invaded, and he does not even know how to deal with his freedom of choice at the bar. When his efforts to reproduce Raymond's old methods fail, in a stroke of pure cinematic genius, the director is able to merge the past, future, and present together in a scene of utmost paranoia, with Robert trying to seek forgiveness from Raymond. By using the same black and white treatment as was used in the footage of Raymond's past, there's a sign given that the child is stuck in cycles of reimagining the future based on his past, as the same scene ends up playing the next day. But when Raymond tells him to get out, suddenly new noises enter into the frame as we are introduced to Emma Stone's Rita in the film, an actor who will later play a devotee of a cult in the third part.
Are you all right? Are you hurt?
Just a little.
A little.
This scene seems like it almost punctures the reality of the story when Robert injures his foot instead of hands, and we'll understand how such movements eerily connect to the other stories of the film in a future video. In this particular frame, for example, while we see Robert and Rita meeting for the first time, the director provokes us by placing paintings of dogs all around the room. Since we know of the second story, we realize how the mythos of the estranged wife in that one is connected to their meeting in this story. When Robert manages to get the keys to Rita's house and enters it, we get to see a painting very reminiscent of artworks on Borromean ring patterns, rings that had inspired Lacan to form a structured visualization of the three interlapping registers of symbolic, imaginary, and the real that form a part of human reality. But Robert's aim is clear. He wants the objet petit a, aka the broken tennis racket, back, because that is what traces him back to Raymond, a time when his life was not in the chaos he now experiences. The objet petit a is hence an object of desire that promises to reform the ego that was once formed in the mirror stage, the ideal that he now sees in Rita, who possesses the object in her own home. In a back shot very similar to the one in the opening scene, we finally see the story come full circle, as Robert running over RMF to confirm his death implies a callback to home with Raymond, making him embrace the validation of his ego ideal as well as father, thanks to his fatal act of kindness. In terms of the cinematography, this three-shot assumes an almost mythical significance to the story, lending a near-religious divinity of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Therefore, this part of Kinds of Kindness is chiefly about the subject as a child, and how a child's imagination can be sacrificed as an act of kindness towards a tyrannical father. In the next part, we'll be looking more closely into the most bizarre section of the triptych, namely, RMF is flying. Just like the first part in Yorgos Lanthimos' Kinds of Kindness, the second part also starts with a phone call. But things are different this time.
Hello?
While Raymond was on the other end of the call, standing for the father figure giving instructions, this time there's only silence on the other side.
I can't hear you.
Why is this so? Such things, besides others, get clear if we look at them from the perspective of philosopher Jacques Lacan, which is exactly what we'll do to decrypt RMF is flying and what it means to the rest of the film. In this part of the triptych, we see an interesting step taken forward in terms of editing.
But they're doing a great job out there. I heard this morning the head of the rescue mission is hopeful.
Jump cuts are taken as a regular part and parcel of the story, something that was only relevant in the scenes of discordance in the Death of RMF. This choice makes us feel the chunks of time being eaten away in between. And this is in sharp contrast to Raymond asking Robert to redo an entire scene within the first story to suit his precise imaginations.
It was better when you said it standing up. So go out and come back in. Do it by yourself without Vivian.
So the question is not about the imaginary anymore. It's about a world beyond it, a world of cope and trauma. Daniel, possibly hurt from bloody encounters as a cop, suffers from bouts of schizophrenia evidenced by when he finds that a suspect looks like his lost wife Liz, who forces are attempting to recover from a faraway island. By later provoking to revisit a pornographic video including Daniel's friends and Liz having intercourse, we are made to feel something off about him. Because Daniel romantically associates memories of his wife with a becoming animal moment in their past, instead of a human symbol or a conscious experience. In fact, animals seem to dominate the subconscious minds of the characters, something we will see more and more of towards the end of the story. But whenever Daniel does or says something in the story, it signals the lack he feels of the other in his life. And it is exactly this feeling of what is missing that makes the story chiefly about the register of the real.
Hello? Yes? Liz?
As per Jacques Lacan, after receiving news that Liz has been rescued and is being carried on a helicopter by none other than RMF, Daniel takes her to the hospital, where he gets a brief deja vu vision from the previous story.
Daniel.
Yes?
This can qualify as a psychotic break in Daniel, a moment of the puncturing of reality such that it enters a different world altogether. In grand ironic fashion, the returning Liz in her persona appears to be exactly the opposite of her past self.
And I made chocolate mousse for dessert. Completely forgot that Liz doesn't eat chocolate. She was so polite about it.
Oh, chocolate, that's what I want.
And this creates tension in the mind of Daniel. The editing adds a layer of postmodern subtlety when Liz is being honored at a party, and we cut from Jesse and Willem talking
Open your eyes and look clearly at what's going on around you.
to a mid-close of RMF standing alive. Is it possible that RMF is actually dead, but is being imagined by Daniel's psychotic mind? Looking at this story from the context of kindness,
Aren't you going to eat something?
the wife mutilates herself to please the other, doubling down on the premise taught by Raymond in the first story, where Robert got the attention of the other by hurting his hands. This time, the only way to satisfy the other's desires for the wife is to cut herself, and by doing so, she affirms Daniel's delusions about the real wife. This might sound a bit counterintuitive, but that is precisely the main characteristic of the real register as per Lacan, which exists precisely as a negation of the reality in favor of the unconscious.
You'll starve to death.
In extension, the story's preoccupation with gore and dead organs provokes the uncanny sense of the real. The repeated close-ups of the feet in the film give us a hint of a turn into the periphery of human anatomy, whose center previously constituted the hands. It is hence no wonder that in this part, the returning Liz is ordered to cut up her fingers and serve it to Daniel. The world negates the hands in favor of the feet. Speaking of the periphery, the sheer idea that RMF can be resurrected into a new world after being dead in the previous one means that it is possible that Liz is also just a resurrected body of Rita, which could explain why Daniel gets the deja vu feeling in the same exact hospital room from the previous story. The real in this world seems to be a mold informed by the life that is missing or seems to be misplaced into the current story. In the mirror stage, which we clearly had a look at in the previous story, according to Jacques Lacan, there is not just a formation of the imaginary order to please the other, but there is also what he calls a méconnaissance, or misrecognition, where the ego starts to misunderstand or misplace objects of the other as objects of his own.
Who gave it to you? This is my phone.
What?
This is my phone.
Are you out of your mind? That's my phone.
Quiet down, sir.
Producing a delusional paranoia that seems to be prevalent in Daniel. It seems like Liz has come out of the world teased on paintings in the previous story, a realm of mythological fable that turns dogs into the owners and humans into chocolate-eating, domesticated animals. This highlights a radical turning of the tables, where the unconscious turns conscious and vice versa. Willem Dafoe as George is now an emasculated father, who is subject to slaps and derision from his own daughter. It is furthermore important to realize how misrecognition forms a part of both Liz and Daniel's behavior. Liz starts smoking out of thin air and becoming capable of pregnancy at the same time that Daniel misrecognizes his own phone, his wife's face, and other such elements. This nonsensical vacuum of the real contrasts the limiting imaginations of the previous story and enables the bizarre presence and flight of RMF, a man we saw getting killed in the previous story. In context to language, Liz eventually starts lying and distorting information merely to serve Daniel's increasingly disturbing demands until it leads to her death, and the void of it opens up the biggest delusion in the head of Daniel, the return of his real wife back home. In this way, while the death of RMF was about the breakdown and reconsolidation of the imaginary world, RMF is Flying is about the corruption of infantile desires, from innocently childish to animalistic and vile, like a descent from that which is mundane and conscious to that which is unconscious and real. Perhaps when leading ourselves to the next part of this triptych, it is important to realize the implications of this final shot to the story. After the ego had a look at his virtual self in the death of RMF, the mind seems to have provoked a double image of two Emma Stones in the frame, almost like they are twins, one of which is dead and the other is alive to fulfill a prophecy. This kind of prophecy is exactly what we'll deal with in the next story, titled RMF Eats a Sandwich. In the third part of Yorgos Lanthimos' Kinds of Kindness, Human anatomy is now carefully weighed in terms of its dimensions, possibly because the cult behind the resurrection experiment does not want to repeat the mistake of a past story, namely a Liz twin whose feet don't match the original. This story explores a third register in Lacanian psychoanalysis after the imaginary and the real, a realm called the symbolic. This time round, our protagonist is armed with a powerful look signified by the purple dodge. Her placement in the story reeks of the quirky private detective vibes of Hollywood whodunits, and she begins by narrating a dream she had last night, reminiscent of Dale Cooper from Twin Peaks. Unlike the past sequences of the previous two stories,
I was in a big, beautiful rectangular pool. The pool had a diving board. Anyway, that's not important. What's important is I was stuck at the bottom of the pool.
this time the sequence holds direct plot significance to the mission of the characters, validating their symbolic potency. In this final part of the triptych, family life is far away from the protagonist as she sneaks into her own empty house to conduct a ritual on her daughter's bed. Our two protagonists, Emily and Andrew, reveal themselves to be a part of a sexual cult that collects pure water, and this arrangement places the cult at the center and relegates the family to the periphery. These members, in fact, seem to have dreams that are monitored and shared to the guru of the cult, Omi. This reveals to us how the psyche of the individual now bows down to the symbolic order of the collective. This cult keeps a check on the entire body of its members using its rituals, effectively regulating their food, water, and sexual intercourse. The father in the first story is now replaced by a group that tracks not just your conscious life but also your subconscious one, which is why Omi now enters their dreams and is the only person they are advised to have sex with. This explains Emily's belief that her dream carries significance towards fulfilling the main project of the cult. She is more focused on her unconscious dreams instead of the conscious mundane reality of having a daughter and husband to live with. When her ex brings to her attention that her daughter hurt her foot at the ballet class, this not only reminds us of the significance of the feet in the last part, but also carries an odd connection to the water ritual she conducted on the Nike shoebox in the girl's room. Home as an element is completely alien to Emily. It is a place where her ex proceeds to assault her against her will by spiking her drink. In fact, it is hinted that she's tricked back into her own house by deception. Her daughter's foot probably really wasn't hurt after all.
How's your foot?
My foot?
And this seems to be a trend from the previous story. In possibly the saddest moment of the film, Emily is distressed about this only because of what it'll mean to her membership in the group. She seems to have become the animal of a cult that unfortunately has no personal esteem or feelings. But speaking of animals, dogs make a comeback into this world when Emily causes a bruise on the leg of one in order to get Ruth's attention, just like the self did in the first story and the other did in the second story. It is unfortunate that often in the ritualistic realm of the symbolic, it is often the animals that end up becoming the scapegoats. In this story, it is interesting to see how the foot goes back to becoming a plot device,
Go.
while the head becomes the enigmatic center of the story. This is significant because it is the human face that forms the symbolic identity of the person, and thus a kiss is the highest form of validation within this cult. Even the tears constitute a part of the divine face of the leaders of this cult. So when it comes to making the ultimate sacrifice, the devotee has to let go of their persona and family life in order to allow their esoteric face to come out. And a suicide by the social twin allows Emily to enable the introverted twin to carry out their ritual. To me, this is the symbolic meaning of RMF Eats a Sandwich, and it finally goes to talk about a devotee's self-sacrificing kindness towards carrying out a collective ritual. But what about the penultimate scene of this film, where RMF literally eats a sandwich? Now that we have thematically broken down each story in Yorgos Lanthimos' kinds of kindness in this series, let's get to the main question. What does each kindness imply in the film? In each part, we get to see individual subjects playing a role to appease another person, and kindness implies a letting go of oneself to fulfill the wishes of the other person. On a broader level, this likens to a desire to shed away your individuality to the institution, whether it be patriarchy, marriage, or even a cult. The director happens to color code the titles of the triptych, and in the very first part, he also has his protagonist hint the symbolic meaning of each color.
This here's Ayrton Senna's helmet. The blue and green stripes symbolized speed and aggression, whereas the yellow all over symbolized youth.
It's notable that here the red in the shoes is given no symbolic meaning, which is in line with our analysis, because in RMF is Flying we get to witness the register of the real, a realm that is precisely about what is lacking and outside the realm of language and meaning.
Hello?
From a postmodern sense, we are constantly made to understand the artificial conditions within which the stories operate, continually giving us a feeling of deja vu and making us conscious of the controller of this experiment, namely Yorgos himself. This is a more sophisticated way of implementing the alienation effect on his audience, as theorized by playwright Bertolt Brecht, highlighted by the excessive use of formalism even in the cinematography, which shifts from wide-angle lenses in the Death of RMF to using anamorphic lenses to highlight the distortion of reality in the symbolic register. By exaggerating the extent to which the subjects in the story feel the need to please the other person, Yorgos makes us aware of the pointlessness of human life and desire. We end up building our values and meanings and actions as a response to the environment we live in, which monitors our language, our body, and even our dreams. By carrying out this absurd experiment, to me the director exhibits the deadly influence of the Borromean knots that tie up our minds and respond to our desires. And by choosing to call these actions acts of kindness, he further makes the point of how we willingly do so, killing ourselves to please the group with ultimately unsuccessful lives. This degeneration in kinds of kindness is highlighted by how the first part ends with 3 people together, the second part ends with 2 people together, the third being dead, and the last part ends with only the subject surviving, realizing that she's left alone in this cold world. Therefore, to me, if there is a moral to be grasped from the film, it is to be as detached from human civilization as RMF was, because the truth, as it appears, is that we'll always be instruments to the big other. We will continue to be killed. We will be remembered and ultimately even resurrected by the same faces living different lives. But at the end of it all, what really seems to matter is if we can eat our sandwich with pride, wiping off all the spilled ketchup and moving forward without any hesitation.